to Folio and next level auth N and Z, or authorization and authentication. I'm Craig McNally with EBSCO, and I'll be presenting along with Vincent Perot. Next. Yep. So kind of a quick introduction. Most of you are probably already aware of this, but Folio's current implementation of authentication authorization is homegrown. It was something that was developed in the very early days of Folio, and it has some limitations. It's a hard thing to do auth the right way, and we've had some challenges in the past. And so as a project matures, as we have new, large, important customers like Library of Congress and Mobius and so forth, it's important that we take a closer look at what we're doing, the protocols that we're using, and rethink whether or not the homegrown solution we have today is where we want to be. So a little bit more background. Folio's access control currently has some limitations. So granting, just starting at the top, granting and managing permissions can be a pain in the neck and can be challenging. If you've ever managed this yourself, you go to assign a permission to a user and you're faced with this super duper long list of permissions, some of which are named, appropriately, and they're easy to understand, and you know exactly what you're assigning. Others maybe not so much, and so there's some inconsistency there. It's difficult to manage, and so that leads to some frustration. It leads to cases where you're trying to grant permission for someone to do something, and you try, okay, let me try this. I think this is the right one. And then, well, no, it's still not working. Well, let me try this other one. No, that's still not working. Okay, well, I'm just going to grant you all these ones instead. And what that ends up, it's not ideal because now the person has more permission than they need, and that's inconsistent with the principle of least privilege. It's also difficult to do some auditing of this stuff. Again, if you've ever worked with the UI permission sets, the visible permission sets, which you typically assign to users, there's this sort of this notion of hierarchy or nesting. And so you could have a UI permission set, which includes or has sub permissions of another UI permission set, of another permission set, and you have this like N level hierarchy, and it's difficult to see exactly what you're granting someone. Folio provides patron groups, and they're not used for authentication or authorization at all. But this notion of staff groups is something that's come to light, and as well as there's some considerations for the extended or enhanced consortial support in Library of Congress work. Next. So before we go any further, let's take a closer look at the existing model and how Folio works today. So you can see here, whether you want to start at the bottom or the top, that essentially most of you guys should know this by now, but modules declare permissions and permission sets via their module descriptors. And if you start at the bottom here, you can see that we have a handful of API endpoints. They're kind of off the screen here, but these blue rectangles represent API endpoints. And oftentimes, or most times, those endpoints are protected by a permission, one or more permissions, right? So those permissions then can get combined into permission sets that are defined by the backend modules. And then those backend module permission sets get rolled into UI permission sets, or even permission sets that are defined by the user. So you can see this nesting that I was talking about, and you can also see the relationship between some of the permission sets, including other permission sets would also have some of the same permissions. So it can be confusing to determine what exactly you're granting someone. There are naming conventions that are loosely followed. That can be problematic in some cases where it's not consistent. And so some permissions use verbs like get, and others use verbs like view. And so that makes it tricky to be able to parse these permission set names and figure out exactly what's going on. So what else am I missing here? Oh, very important, the last bullet here, access control is applied at the API level. So is basically what it boils down to is via some combination of these permissions or permission sets, you as a user have the ability to call an API or you don't. That's about the level of permission. That's the level of control that you have. Next. So how do we get to the next level, right? Where are we taking this? So we're proposing sort of a new model where Folio access control can be improved through introduction of some new terms, right? So the notion of a capability is to define an ability to perform an action on a Folio resource. So an example of that would be edit. There's a verb there in instance record. And we'll get into this a little bit more. Edit as sort of a verb or an action is one component to this, and instance record, on the other hand, is sort of the what, and that's sort of the resource. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. The next term we're introducing is roles, which is sort of a grouping or collection of capabilities, which can then be assigned to a user. So an example of that might be a cataloger or an administrator or data export role. And finally, policies. And this is why I thought that last bullet on the previous slide about API being sort of the level of control. Policies allow us to apply restrictions beyond the API, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But policies are attached to capabilities, not roles. And an example of that is sort of a time-based policy. So instead of, as a user, being able to call an API or not being able to call an API, policies allow you to do stuff like you're able to call this API during normal business hours, Monday through Friday, right? Here's a visualization of the model that we're proposing. It does look significantly different than where we are today, the previous picture. So you can start at the bottom of the top. The bullets on the right start at the top. So I guess we'll go that direction. Users are assigned to roles. And like I said before, those roles are things like, circulation librarian or data import or so forth, right? Those roles are comprised of capabilities, and you can see the capabilities there are the circles. And as I was mentioning before, the two pieces that comprise a capability are an action, that's sort of the verb, and a resource. And then you see policy there is the diamond. And as I mentioned before, that gets attached to a capability. They're reusable. They can be attached to multiple capabilities if needed. And the one final thing that I want to mention here is that it could be possible to assign a capability directly to a user. So without that role layer in there. And that may be beneficial in areas like institutional users or system users, or even to provide sort of a customized, so let's just say you have some roles for that align with your business needs, but that doesn't necessarily map to reality where, well, we have Susan and she's an acquisitions librarian, but she also does these other couple things over here. Instead of having to create a role that has that sort of union of those things, you could assign her the acquisition librarian role and then capabilities to sort of augment that and get you where you need. Next. So this, it should look familiar. It's essentially the same diagram as before, only with examples, right? So here we have two roles at the top, acquisitions manager and acquisitions observer. And those are comprised of these capabilities. So you can see the acquisitions manager would obviously need to do everything within acquisition. So create orders, delete orders, edit orders, and view orders. So though all four of these capabilities get rolled into the acquisition manager role. For acquisitions observer, they're just an observer. So they don't need to delete, create, or edit things. They just need to be able to view them. So in this case, the acquisitions observer would just get the capability for view orders. And so the actions and resource here, the resource is orders for all of these capabilities, but you can see the action is, create, delete, edit, and view. And so the time-based policy, I kind of already touched on this as an example, but that could be, Monday through Friday or 9 to 5 or whatever it is. Next. So now in the next couple slides, we're going to sort of drill into each of those in a little bit more detail. So capabilities is where we'll start, and this is the ability to perform an action on a resource. Again, those two pieces, action and resource. Capabilities are defined by the system. So these aren't things that you would define as a librarian or an admin. These would be defined by the system, probably by a module descriptor or something like that. There are different categories of capabilities. So as you guys are aware, there are a bunch of RESTful APIs in Folio, and there are some that are more RPC oriented, things like checkout by barcode, right? There's no sort of resource there. It's more of a procedural thing. So we have capabilities for both types of things, right? So sort of data capabilities and procedural capabilities, or resource capabilities and procedural. As far as actions go, we've kind of covered this already, but the new thing here is we have for the resource capabilities, you would have actions like view, edit, update, or view, edit, create, delete. I think update and edit there, that's a typo. It should be one or the other. And then for procedural, there's only one action, and that would be execute, right? Because you don't perform any other operation. There's only one to do, right? A capability can sit on top of the existing permission model, right? So and act as sort of a normalization layer. I mentioned before that the permissions that we have in the system today, there's some consistency in how they're named and so forth, but it's not always followed. So there are some edge cases. There are things about that make it difficult to work with sometimes. So this capability sort of acts as a normalization layer, and that it's very clear. It's explicitly clear about what the action, what the resource is, right? There are some challenges associated with migrating from permissions to capabilities. Capabilities and resources and actions may mostly be inferred from the permission names. I kind of already touched on this. So that's all about the consistency of amongst the naming and so forth. We did take a look at this, and we looked at, would it be possible to derive the capabilities, essentially identify, given a permission, what the associated action and resource would be. And it worked in some cases, but not always, especially when you're looking at the multiple levels of, UI permissions often use verbs like view or manage, and then in the back end you have things like get and post and so forth. So it was difficult. So there's a need for this sort of normalization, I think. So we have some mock-ups, and this is fairly rough, but this is how we think some of this might look in the system. So here, this is you can see a capabilities accordion, and on the left-hand side here, you see application. This obviously builds upon some of the other concepts and presentations that Vince and I have given over the last couple of days here. So the notion that that an application has provides a set of resources. You can ignore resource sets. That was an idea that we were looking at, and I think we've scrapped. So disregard that. But then you can see in this sort of grid here that it lists all the various actions for each of the resources. So you have loan policies as a resource here, and you have the actions view, edit, create, delete, and manage. And then you can see how many policies might be attached to those particular resources. From our perspective, this is a lot more easy to visualize what exactly is going on, as opposed to just a giant list of things. It's a better visual experience, I think. Next. And this is essentially the same thing, only from the view of the RPC capability. So there's only one action here, as mentioned before, and that's execute. And you can see some of the examples of some of these procedural type, things in the system, like checkout by barcode, check-in by barcode, and so forth. There are others in the acquisition side as well for receiving and things like that. Next up is roles. So roles provide a mechanism to deliver sets of capabilities to users. So it's sort of going back to that diagram. It's what sits between the capabilities and the users. It's a collection of capabilities. And there's an idea where, the system could in theory provide a set of default or standard roles out of the box, say as reference data. That could then be, it would be sort of a jumping off point for libraries, right? And then obviously we would need some input from subject matter experts and SIGs to help determine what those roles look like typically. But of course, roles unlike capabilities, they may be provided by the system in some, like I just mentioned, but this is where customization would happen. So if you're a library and you organize things differently than others, well, do you have an opportunity to make those customizations at the role level? You could create new roles, you can make adjustments to the existing ones and so forth. And finally, they don't necessarily need to align with job titles. I think that's an easy way to think about it, and maybe an easy way to organize these, but it's not a restriction. They could be at different granularities. I mean, we were looking at the examples we had earlier were like administrator, right? Well, that pretty much has everything. But then you have things like data export, which may be it's not really a job title per se. It's a functionality, right? Next. So here's our mock-up of role management. You can see, obviously, there's some metadata associated with a role, a name and a description. There's probably some change metadata as well, like created by and so forth, that's managed by the system. And then, of course, you have this capabilities. This is already what you guys saw, sort of a slightly different view of it, but this is where you would, click the boxes, or each of these boxes essentially aligns to a capability, right? So like I said before, loan policies view, if you click that box, it would be adding that capability that's associated with the loan policy resource and the view action to the circulation role that we're creating here. We'll get to this a little bit more later, but this cog here, or this gear, that's where you would essentially attach policies to the capabilities in this row. So, and you can see that some of these asterisks, some of these cells in the grid have an asterisk, and that just indicates that there's a policy attached to that capability. One or more. Yep. So before you advance, go a little bit more on that. So you can see here, there's a number 2 under policies for this loan rules row, right? But there's only one asterisk. So you could sort of infer that, okay, well, the create loan rules must have 2 policies attached to it. So this is just an idea for how this might be presented. Maybe we can come up with some better UX designs. I don't know. This mock-up is about assignment of roles. So, and it's very similar actually to what we have in today for assigning permissions to users, right? So on the left-hand side, you have some filters. In this case, the one that's really important is user assignment status. So if you want to see all the users that are assigned to this role, you would click assigned and you get that list. If you want to do the inverse, you would click on assigned, right? And there may be other filters here. We put patron group in there, but we haven't got to the level of really sorting out those details. It was sort of illustrative, and that's what the intent was.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So one important thing that is implicit here is that in this model as proposed, you actually are looking at for a given role, who has the role, which is not something you can currently do. So you can slice it both ways. You can say, here's a user, what are their users' roles, which Folio provides, but this is for a given role, who actually has that.
Thank you. All right, so that's it for roles. Moving on to policies. Having a consistent and standardized capabilities model coupled with roles should allow future enhancements in the form of policies. So we kind of already touched on some of this, but I think this sort of level of control or greater control in general has been something that the Folio community has been asking for. It doesn't address all of the needs or requirements, but it's a step in giving us greater flexibility for authorization. It allows us to apply these restrictions to a capability. And policies allow for dynamically restricting capabilities at runtime. That's sort of an important point here, is that these adjustments can be made in a running system. It's not something that you would need a developer to change in a module descriptor or something like that. It's dynamic, it's runtime, which is great. One of the, sort of the poster child that we've come up for with this, this example is basically the case where you have a student library worker, and so that maybe they're working at a circulation desk or something. And in today's system, they would be able to either perform circulation or not, right? And there's no way to control it any further than that. If you're able to introduce time-based policies, for instance, or maybe other types of policies, you would be able to restrict them to say, okay, you can only do circulation during normal business hours or during your shift on the particular days that you're working. And that would prevent them from going back to their dorm room or on a Saturday renewing their friends' books or whatever, right? Getting in and messing in the system. So it's something that today's system can't do, and it can be very powerful. Here's the mock-up that we have for policy management. Oh, and I see that there are questions coming in chat. We'll finish this. Got it. Right. So for managing policies, I showed you that little cog in one of the previous mock-ups. When you click that, you would essentially get this, and this modal or pop-up would apply to the context of that particular row or that resource that we're looking at, right? And I mentioned several times now that policies are attached to capabilities, and you remember the intersection of that resource and that action constitutes a capability. So here, since we're managing the policies at sort of the row level, you're presented with this very familiar grid of the actions on sort of the x-axis. And so here you can see we've selected weekdays for the create the weekdays policy, which is Monday through Friday, for the create action. And I think I mentioned already that policies can be reused. So weekdays is something that's very general, right? It's not tied to any specific resource or action. In theory, you could reuse this weekdays policy on multiple capabilities, multiple areas, and that's perfectly reasonable. Okay, so should we try to get to, actually click next. I'm not sure what the next slide is. Should we address the question first? Okay. Okay, so adding roles and capabilities to Folio. This is sort of now that we've gone through what exactly are roles, capabilities, policies, how might we introduce this or incorporate this into Folio? So we could introduce a new application, a new module, mod roles, and this could support the roles plus capabilities functionality without the policies. The policy stuff I think would require a lot more sort of deeper interaction with the system. We could map existing permissions to capabilities. I already mentioned that maybe we do that in the module descriptor. Maybe it's a new section, or it could even be a different descriptor. I don't know yet. We could map. Oh, right. And this is it's sort of redundant, but we could do that for both the RESTful capabilities as well as the procedural ones. We could manage assignments of capabilities to staff users via roles. So the mod roles could broker these things. So as you associate roles with users, mod roles could then make calls into mod permissions to assign the appropriate permissions to the user. So it's sort of a middleman in that sense. So you would have the benefit of the new terminology, the new user experience, and so forth. The easier manageability of this stuff without having to muck with and deal with individual permissions. Yeah, this is a good place to pause actually, because I was going to turn it over to Vince, but let's check out the question. Okay, so the question was, could session conditions of policies be data-driven, like a user can drop fines in library B only? This might be helpful in large institutions. So in theory, I think policies could be very flexible. So far, I've mentioned time-based policies. I think that could be extended to have to be a lot more flexible than just time. It could be, you know, a scripted policy or an aggregated policy or something that combines others. There's a lot of possibilities here, I think.
So the poster child example we gave of the student librarian dealt with both the time-based policy example and also the location-based policy. So you wouldn't want the student librarian to start manipulating the system when they go back to their dorm room. You'd only want them to do it in the library. And I think that fits the question here in terms of allowing something to occur only in one particular library. It's location-based policies.
The next question was about would the list of policies be extensible or is it fixed? I mentioned that we might have sort of out of the box roles or sort of a standard set of roles that the system could provide, but also that roles could be user defined and custom, right? For policies, I think they'd be almost entirely user defined. So certainly extensible. The same question for actions. Actions essentially align to those would be system defined. I don't think that that's something that you would extend. It essentially maps to the APIs that are provided by the system. Okay, so I think that's it for the questions. So oh.
Very early slides with the arrows. Oh, yes, thank you. From one of the very early slides with the arrows pointing and so forth, it wasn't clear if users can have more than one role. Can you clarify that?
Yes, users can definitely have more than one role. Yeah, I think that's it, right? A couple more questions.
So how do you envision the configuration how do you envision the configuration going for those capabilities that do not correspond to a CRUD-based permission or a CRUD-based surface? You know, because the UI is very much, what was it? View, edit, delete, something, manage. And then, but I'm thinking, like, what about those services where you're asking for an action to happen?
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually have a mock-up of that, I believe.
Checkboxes.
Yes, this one right here. So you see this and this, oh, yeah. The chat window's in the way, but yeah, you can see that there's just one action column in this grid here.
No. Oh.
So there's a.
I actually have two questions. The first one is, are you going to allow role inheritance?
Hold the microphone closer to you.
Oh, sorry. Are you going to allow role inheritance? So for instance, right now we have a view all permission set that we assign to all staff, but that can be inherited by another permission set. Are you thinking of doing the same thing with roles, or will have to be set individually?
So at this point, I think it was a conscious decision to not do that because because of the same, we didn't want to fall into the same pitfalls that we did with the current system where things are nested indefinitely, right? And it's difficult to see exactly what is assigned to a user, or even exactly what a certain role has, right? So there was a conscious decision to keep it flat.
Second question is about the capabilities, because right now a lot of the permissions are, as you said, like specifically to a specific API call, which runs into issues where, like in inventory, it's making an API call to, let's say, orders or something of that nature. Are you thinking of combining those capability, all that under one capability, or still keeping it granular where you would have to assign the two capabilities of view inventory and then view orders? I'm mainly asking because of external systems that connect to Folio currently. The granularity is nice because you can only give it access to specific API endpoints.
Yeah, I'll give a shot at that. The idea is, yes, that there is the notion that probably isn't in the slides here. You may have seen the resource set and that idea. The idea of getting aggregation of capabilities into a capability set. That's something that's part of the very latest version of the thinking.
Yeah, we toyed around with incorporating that into this presentation, but the dust hasn't settled yet. It wasn't fully baked, so we left it out.
I wonder why you want to create a new module. Isn't it a perfect fit to put this new things into the existing mod permissions module because they are highly connected?
I think the approach that we'd like to take here is one that allows you to opt in to something like this to ease the transition. So if we were to just take this and incorporate it directly into mod permissions, and that version of mod permission gets into the Q release or whatever it is, the R release, well, then you're kind of forced to use it, or you need to sort of have like the APIs might get a little bit confusing which way you're using it. If you introduced a new module that works with roles that sits on top of the existing system, if you want to use it, you enable that module and the corresponding UI modules, which would allow you to do the management. And if you didn't want to, you could still continue to use permissions directly without this layer on top of it. It was done intentionally for sort of transition purposes.
That's correct. And if you just hold that thought, Julian, for a bit, on the later part of this presentation, there might be some other reasons why we'd want to do it this way. Hold on to it, yeah.
So one last question. Do you see capabilities as possibly allowing some more granular constraints than we can do now with our current permissions? What I'm thinking specifically is cases where you want to restrict permissions on part of a record. You know, like you want someone to be able to see enough of the patron record that you can see their barcode, but you don't want that. We don't want someone in a particular role being able to see the contact information or the address. Or maybe you can view some parts of an order or some parts of a fund, but not particularly sensitive financial parts.
So as looked at so far, it does not go to that level. It sits above the existing permission level, which is really at the API level. So it sits on top of the API level. We're extending it a bit with policies. There might be some creative way to introduce policies there, but as described here, it does not get into that. The questions here? All right, let's move on. All right, so next little section, let's talk a little bit about Folio in the Library of Congress, which is part of our motivation for doing this. We started thinking harder about this initially when the Mobius project came on, but also with the Library of Congress, we don't have, you want to go back to the slides? We don't have, we don't have the ability to, we can sort of get by in Folio with security, but the security requirements are just not going to be met with the homegrown solutions. So we have to look a little further. So next slide over here. So, the Library of Congress introduces a lot of security considerations. They're a federal agency. They have a number of requirements. They have sensitive data to deal with, be it user data or material data. There's a number of standards that need to be complied with in order to get hosting certified with them. They also extend they go beyond what we can do in a simple solution with Folio. For example, we can sort of support identity providers with, as long as there's SAML and Folio currently, but turns out maybe they want to support multiple SAML providers for a given user. We need to focus a little more on that principle of least privilege, which gets to that auditability. We want to make sure that we know who has what permissions, so we can limit for sure and not have that solution where you give 3 strikes and on the 3rd strike you get all permissions because you couldn't figure it out. Session timeouts are something that Folio does not currently support, and we need to focus on that. It's not specifically related to what we just saw, but that is an additional authentication authorization requirement. There has been other things that we have to start considering also. Folio currently is kind of wide open. It's actually, don't tell anybody, it's kind of vulnerable because there's no rate limiting, there's no throttling in what we have currently. And bot detection is another aspect of this. So the Library of Congress is scaling to serve. It's got a very large number of people who will be using this. There's 3,000 staff in all. It deals with multiple country requirements, and it has reading rooms, which are not necessarily a concept that Folio has explored into supporting. So these are all challenges that drive us to take a closer look at what Folio can do for authorization, authentication, and how to take it to the next level to address these needs. So I think that leads to the next set of slides, which is, all right, we have a homegrown solution in Folio, and sure, we could grow it and make it work better and do the extra things we need for Library of Congress. But on the other hand, maybe a better way to do it is to look at a well-established third-party set of libraries that provide all the stuff that we actually need and somehow make use of it within Folio. So with that in mind, Keycloak came up. It was come up before in the core platform team discussions early on. It's been adopted by some of the other projects in the OLF. So we thought we should take a look at that and do an evaluation. Do you want to do?
So thank you, Vince, for the introduction to Keycloak. What exactly is Keycloak? As Vince mentioned, this is something that has been mentioned, has kicked around a little bit. Going back to when I was on the core platform team, I think one of the solution architects said, wait a second, what we're trying to do this refresh token thing. Why are we trying to do it ourselves? Why are we trying to reinvent the wheel? Things like Keycloak can do this for us. And it didn't gain traction at that time, but now there's significant need for it with some of these large customers coming on board and adopting Folio. So what is Keycloak? It's an open source project for identity and access management. It supports a lot of things. Most of this stuff is taken right from their homepage. So standard authentication protocols, things like OpenID Connect, OAuth 2 and SAML 2, user federation, so you can tie into LDAP and Active Directory. It's extensible. You can customize code in what's called their SPIs. There's very flexible password policies for password management, and you can do things like, okay, we want your password's good for 6 months, and we're going to force you to change your password, things like that, right? Everyone's familiar with those sorts of things. A robust development community. I think it seems like, I don't know if it's a regular cadence, but it seems like they're coming out with a new release every couple months. And of course, it's on the Apache 2.0 license, which is convenient for us. And there's a link there to the Keycloak website. Looking a little bit deeper into this, we did do an evaluation. So we didn't just look at their homepage and say, hey, this is what it's doing. So we looked a little bit closer. Some of the things that we identified as being potentially beneficial to Folio would be multi-factor authentication, complex password management lifecycle and policies. SAML single logout is something that some of our customers have asked for repeatedly, and that Folio has kind of said, yeah, we're not going to do that. Support for simultaneous multiple identity providers. Right now, Folio supports a single identity provider for SAML, and that has been sort of problematic for some of our customers in the past. Built-in access control, so role-based access control, attribute-based, context-based, user-based. It supports a whole slew of these things. And of course, along the same lines of what Vince was mentioning about FedRAMP compliance, it does have compliance with some of the standards, with the standards that are required by FedRAMP. It does not check some of the boxes in those requirements that Vince mentioned, things like rate limiting, throttling, bot detection. Those things typically would be applied at the API gateway level. So it doesn't do everything that we want it to do, but it checks most of the boxes. So roles and capabilities, next level. We could, earlier I went through how we could build some of this stuff on top of the existing system using, a new module like mod roles that brokers calls to, mod permissions and so forth. We could go to the next level and incorporate Keycloak to enable some of this stuff for us without having to, continue to roll our our own implementation of Auth. It would allow us to add policies. It would support a lot of the all the features that I just mentioned, the multiple identity providers, the standard protocols. That's a huge one. Things like OpenID Connect and OAuth. And it maps well to the proposed model. So on the left-hand side is sort of a simplified version of the proposed model that we sort of went through, with resources, actions rolling into capabilities, and those capabilities rolling into, roles, and then users being assigned to those roles. On the right-hand side, as part of our evaluation, we looked at how do these things map? Would this proposed model even map to Keycloak at all? And as it turns out, it does map fairly well. So the notion of resource is reused here. I mean, they actually call it the same exact thing. Scope and action are pretty much analogous here. Permission and Keycloak permission loosely maps to a capability. It's sort of the combination of all these things. And just like on the proposed model, we have policies which are assigned to the capabilities as well. And so it all maps pretty well. There's some of this that gets a little bit more complicated at the policy level that we would be hiding if we were to implement this in Folio, but sort of behind the scenes, we would need some things like aggregate policies to say, okay, to attach the role to a capability, you need sort of a role-based policy, but also if you wanted to attach a time-based policy to that same capability, or in this case, permission, you would need to have some sort of aggregate policy that combines those two. And you can see that Keycloak supports both and or they use different terminology. It's like unanimous or consensus. And it does support the ability to assign capabilities or permissions directly to the user. And that would be done via a user-based policy. So it does seem to map fairly well. It's not a direct one-to-one in all cases, but it seems like it's doable. So all that said, where do we go from here? We sort of suggested two different approaches we could take to implementing this. One on top of the existing Folio, modules, and the other being adopting something like Keycloak. I think there's merit, and it's definitely worthwhile to take a closer look at Keycloak. So we're doing a proof of concept. It's looking at what would need to change in order to integrate Keycloak with Folio. So we're looking at things like splitting user information. Obviously, if you're authenticating and using Keycloak with to do authorization, you need some representation of the user in Keycloak. So splitting the user information, maybe that means taking some of the information that's part of the user record and the user permission assignment records and the credentials that live in mod login, and rolling that all up and storing all that stuff in Keycloak, while a lot of the sort of person information, the stuff like first and last name, their contact information, their patron groups, default service points, Keycloak doesn't need to know a lot of that stuff. So keeping that in Folio makes sense. Bridging the gap between the proposed Folio model, the model that we just proposed, and then the Keycloak one. So like I said, it does map fairly well based on what we've seen, but the proof of concept will prove that out. Account for ongoing parallel efforts. So there's a bunch of things going on right now, like enhanced consortium support. Also refresh token rotation, which I think is coming in Poppy. So these things are already in progress. We need to account for them as we go through our proof of concept to make sure that we're not introducing conflicts or problems along the way. Adoption of standard protocols. That's, I've mentioned this multiple times now, but OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, these are things that we kind of got dinged on a while back when there was a security audit. And I think it's the type of thing that as Folio grows up, we should start using some of these real things, not our homegrown stuff. And obviously adjustments to leverage the other sort of enhanced functionality that Keycloak provides, all those things that I was mentioning about password management, lifecycle policies, key rotation, all those other things. So this likely means changes to Folio Core. Exactly what that looks like is still TBD, but this is work in progress. It's underway, and so look forward to sharing some updates on it soon.
Right.
So that's it. I think we're a little bit ahead of time, but this leaves time for questions. So.
You talked about rate limiting, bot detection, throttling at the API gateway level. And we typically say that Okapi is an API gateway. I'm hoping that instead of burdening Okapi with that, we might think of a web application firewall in front of Okapi before doing that, before embedding that into Okapi itself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a number of technologies we can do to put in front of a copy, whether it's a WAF or another gateway for that matter, that just serves the role of filtering things out. But it would be problematic to burden Okapi, and if only on one hand the effort to modify it, the risk that we take in modifying something that's so core right now. Agree. Odd.
Thank you. I think these changes to the permissions models are really appealing. Certainly when we've been trying to manage our permissions, we've been trying to effectively construct capabilities and roles out of these very granular things and put them into permission sets. And it's just not worked very well or sustainably without having that kind of support within the project. So that's fantastic. Do you see the capabilities model and the adoption of Keycloak as being two different possible paths? Or do you see them as like the capabilities is the way you want to go, and it's a question of whether you would implement it by way of Keycloak?
I think what was pointed out, maybe not clearly, was that the roles and capability model, that happens in Folio, and we could do it on the existing system. We can do most of it. I think doing policies would be something a little extra that we don't really have a lot of structure to do in Folio, so we could do most of it, not all of it. But why do that? If we can get it for a better, more robust solution on Keycloak, the work in Folio for roles and capabilities, the management thereof, is kind of the same in both cases. It's UI work, it's modules and what have you. What the modules talk to on the back end is slightly different. Questions? Oh, Peter.
So one of the last slides, it talked about likely means changes to Folio Core. Can you put a scope around that? Are we talking about having to change all of the UIs? Are the folks that do UI going to have to go into each module and each set of JavaScript and change something there? Or is it further down in Okapi? Can you just kind of scope what changes to Folio Core means?
Right. So first, just to explain, Folio Core is a reference to some of the previous conversations, the platform discussion, where we described Folio as being a tiered solution, and you have the core at the base, which includes Okapi, but also includes some of the absolute essential things. So, I described it yesterday, I believe, that Folio Core is just enough to get yourself a running Folio that does nothing. You can log into it and you can't do anything. So in that exists, mod auth token, mod users, mod permissions, all the authentication layer is in there. So what we're saying is in order to integrate some of these changes in the authentication code, there's going to probably have to be some changes to the pieces that manage the authentication now. So if only, like Craig mentioned, splitting like the users up into, person users versus auth users. So that would be a change to mod users to do that. There would likely be some changes to at least a UI module, maybe an addition of a module to Folio Core to handle the selection and management of capabilities and roles, which doesn't currently exist. So that's sort of where that was going. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Craig?
Yeah, I think the number of UI modules that would be touched here is fairly small. We won't know until we get through the rest of this POC, but it does seem clear to me that changes to Stripes or Stripes core would probably be necessary, since that's instrumental in the authentication flow, both for SSO as well as the standard login. So as the UI, it's sort of an orchestration component in a lot of senses for those things. And so it makes sense that would need to change.
In the back end?
Yeah, in the back end, we already talked about mod users, probably mod users BL, since that's the one that sort of sits between the UI and mod users, and is also used as part of the password management flows. So, resetting your password and setting passwords, those sorts of things happen in mod users BL. I'm guessing mod auth token, that's obviously a no-brainer. And like Vince said, any of the pieces that sort of touch on authorization or authentication are sort of areas where I would look first and say, well, those probably need some adjustments. The scope of the changes is sort of TBD at this moment.
Okay.
Do you expect any changes are going to be necessary for other modules outside Folio Core?
Good question. Hopefully not. I think it'd be great if we could limit the blast radius of this, so that we didn't have to invest a lot of time from the various development teams that are busy working on other things that are necessary, for enhanced consortia support and data, everything that we've been talking about during this WOLFcon conference. All these things, it'd be unfortunate if we would have to take away resources that need to be dedicated to working on those things for this. And so limiting the blast radius would be ideal.
First question, do you think would this allow you to prevent password-based logins for some users that were SSO users?
For SSO, certainly, because that's up to the identity provider, right? So if your identity provider allows for passwordless login via like biometrics or whatever it is, then yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I may have said that correctly. To prevent password-based logins in Folio, like you have a local password, you have an account in Folio right now. If you have single sign-on, you can also have a local password, and the password reset always works. So you can't prevent someone with an SSO account from creating a local password and using that instead of single sign-on.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was unaware of that. That's an interesting little loophole. But it does make sense now that you mention it. I don't know. I mean, it's something we would have to look at in Keycloak to see. Keycloak, from what I've seen so far, is very customizable, is very flexible. I'd be surprised if you weren't allowed to add those sorts of restrictions.
And does this presume that we've done the app work already, that we've transitioned to using apps instead of modules?
No, I don't think it's. I don't think that's a necessary thing.
What sort of capability by with the current structure?
Right. I think I mentioned earlier that capabilities could be provided or defined in the module descriptors. Obviously, that would require changes to the module descriptor, or you could introduce a new type of descriptor. I'm not sure if that's the direction we'd want to go, but
it's not strictly necessary because it's independent model. But as you saw in the mock-ups, when you're composing those roles with the assignment of capabilities, the ability to first start an application and drill down to the resources it offers is a convenience. right? If you don't have the application layer, we could put something else in there, but modules for that matter, but it's a convenience, so I would say. Questions? Half an hour, even an hour and a half.
We still have a half an hour.
That's okay. We don't have to take it. Vince's first.
Okay, great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, feel free to reach out to Vince or I, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Thank you.